The lobster industry in Maine is a very big part of the economy, and with that, as you would imagine, you've got a lot of people lobstering. During the prime time of fishing, there's a lot of gear in the water, and that creates its own unique challenges, because if you're not used to navigating around that gear, especially if you've got tides or currents going on, or if you don't know like how your boat would interact with those traps while you're passing by them, could cause some problems, and you could even get hitched up on them or stuck. In Maine especially, you have a lot of fully keeled boats still. This is the best case scenario if you're running over a lobster pot under sail. So if you catch a lobster pot, you can see the general shape right here runs all the way down along the hull. And for the most part, there's really nothing to catch the lobster pot if you run it over. The only spot on this boat that I can see really that could catch it is right here, but it's such a small spot that it's possible that it will just come off. In most fully keeled boats, if you do catch something in this little notch, if you start making one big turn to weather, you know, like if you round the boat up, we call it a chicken jibe, but if you kind of go off the wind a little bit while you still have your speed going, and you turn up into the wind just to the point like you're almost going to tack, and then you just fall right off and you almost go into a jibe. If you do that, sometimes it just slacks up the pressure of the water running on the hull enough to let that line slack off and just float out on its own. And then once it does, if that does happen, basically there's nothing else for it to catch on. This huge rudder is attached in a way that, and it has a shape that's just going to shed it off. And then if you look in behind, there's really nothing else to catch the trap. And most boats like this have a very small aperture. There's not a lot of propeller exposed to actually catch the line. And that line would be like way down here as it's trying to leave. It's not going to be like leaving right beside this. So this is the second best kind of keel, and you can see the same thing. You've got the same entry as you do in the full keel. Basically, as the trap would get caught on like this, it would also go down the length of the keel all the way to here, but then you have this cutout part right here where it could possibly snag, but what usually happens is that if it gets past the cutout, it comes all the way back to this skeg-held rudder. And so when you have this arrangement, it's very similar to the other arrangement, and most of the time the trap's going to go out. But you notice that this has a larger aperture where the prop is than the other one, so you do have a little bit more possibility of that lobster trap being like sucked into this hole, especially if the motor's running, or just getting wedged in if you've got like some side current. However, it's still significantly better than a fin keel, because you can see that the rudder is up higher, and so usually, unlike that notch before in the other boat, if you get past this, it's just going to pass right off the back of the rudder. In this kind of arrangement too, right, you have to worry about like the size of the aperture, but you notice that the rudder on this boat is actually up pretty far, and you've got a skeg that goes down the whole length of the hull. So that's allowing the lobster trap would, you know, if it got caught underneath, would go along the hull. The biggest thing you'd have to worry about though, right, is the prop. The rudder itself is up too high, so by the time the line passes the skeg, it's probably just going to pass over the rudder. But if you've got the prop engaged, one technique you can use with a boat like this is that if you're going over the lobster trap and you suddenly see it, just take the boat out of gear. And if you take the boat out of gear, the prop's still going to spin a little bit, but there's a good chance that it's just going to pass by, because you're not going to suck. You don't have so much water being sucked into the prop when it's out of gear that it might just slide right over the hull. And if you do get it caught in there, if you do take it out of gear, you're not going to wrap it up so tight that you can't get it out. So it's possible that you would actually be able to just put it into gear and reverse, and it might just pop off as long as you do it really slowly. So in this boat, in a lot of ways, is like the worst kind of scenario for a lobster trap setup, because you've got this huge space back here, and then you've got this completely unprotected prop just hanging off the strut. This is an example of somebody using something that's on the boat and modifying it in a way. But what happens a lot of times with a boat like this is that the worst part is the rudder, because the line just like somehow, you know, if the prop's not running, there's a chance it'll just roll right off until it gets to the back of the boat. But then there's this perfect size to really pinch a line in there. And because the line is of similar size, it's hard to see, but it catches it in the bigger part. But then when the line becomes narrower, it actually gets wedged right in here between the rudder shaft and the rudder tube. And then like you also kind of lose your steering, right? So, and it's almost impossible to get that out. It's in a really hard place in the boat to remove it. This isn't a true sail drive, but there are sail drives that basically work like an outboard motor that comes straight down, but in the sense that this can't be picked up, it's the same. But sometimes if you have that exact same scenario that we just had and we talked about the rope, with a sail drive, if you take the engine out of gear and the line is just caught up in here in one of these fin areas or along the straight shaft, like sometimes it's just the pressure of the boat. And so you can either try to work that line down the hull itself to like get it and pull it clear. And then talking about motors, this just happens to have a kicker motor on it too. But outboard motors, if you catch a lobster pot, usually what will happen is that the engine will just stall, and people have the best advantage if they're in an outboard engine, because you can just lift the tilt back up on the boat, and once you put the engine out of the water, you can usually get at the lobster pot and just manually unwrap it off of the prop itself. In a boat like this where you've got the twin screws, you know, and you basically have two struts holding each one of these drive shafts, and then you've got a very large prop, so you got a lot of pressure on it, and you can notice that that's a really large drive shaft. But look at how small the rudders are. And the rudders are like useful to an extent, right? Like when you're just driving, they're going to work. But when you're doing small maneuvers, right, the rudders are almost inefficient. So you're really doing everything else twin screwing with the actual props when you come to the dock, and that's your majority of your steerage. So it makes a lot of sense for the mobility of the boat, and you know it's good to have redundancy in a boat like this. But those little tiny props up in Maine, and you sometimes see like something similar like that with stabilization props on big yachts, they just catch everything. And then you've got all of this open space up in here to catch things. And you can tell that this boat has spurs on it, because this boat's probably been up here before and caught a line, and it's just so easy to be disabled in a boat like this, you know, and you don't want to cause so much pressure on one of these that you break them off of the hull, because then you've got a really serious situation with flooding. So this is kind of, in a weird way, the worst case scenario for a motorboat up here. So if this is the arrangement you have, and it's really a common arrangement, and you just need to really try to stay away from lobster pots. And in some places, you know, it's just really hard to do that. If you don't have a lot of extra space and you've got to travel through lobster pots, you should just think about going through them really slowly. So this is also an arrangement that you can see that this person has actually tried to mitigate the possibility of catching a trap, and has taken what looks maybe like a grounding plate, or has made his own grounding plate and moved it slightly forward. And if you look on both sides, there's a fin coming out. So this fin would possibly help you move the trap if it got up close enough to the prop. And you can see like this is well outside of the prop. So if the prop were spinning under power, you know, it's possible that it will get you past the trap, and probably would. Like the line would probably pass, because you'd be moving too fast for it to be sucked into this. It'd like have to get out and around and back, which it wouldn't do. I like this one a little bit better than some of the other ones because it seems a lot more structural. Like this is a pretty good piece of steel. It's through bolted on both sides. You know, if he's used it, you know, also as a grounding plate, it's like, you know, he's able to put a zinc here. It makes a lot of sense. So you'll see around some props that there's actually like a cage. So when the powerboat is moving forward, it can't pull up a lobster trap, because it would have to get into the cage, but it just can't be sucked around it. And so the only danger with a cage is if you're like backing down over a lobster pot. So it's a pretty good situation, because for the most part going forward, it's always going to shed the lobster pot away from the prop as you're moving forward. And if you can imagine, like the hull itself is pushing water away, so is that cage. So when the lobster pot hits, it's going to get thrown around to the side where the prop is pulling from and pushing from, and on the side where the water is being pushed out, eventually that trap will just get pushed off around the cage.